Here are my recollections of goods and services and shops available in Billington, say from 1925 to 1950. First of all, I think about Proctor's Farm. Proctor's Farm is at the top of the nab as you enter the Whalley Banks Road, and it was farmed then by Mr. and Mrs. Johnny Rushton. In the field opposite the house were 4 or 5 swings and a seesaw, and on the roadside a little wooden hut from which Mrs. Rushton sold toffee and sweets, and she also boiled water, and you could get a jug full of water to brew your own tea, or you could get a jug full of tea along with half a dozen cups for a charge of about a shilling, and maybe 5 shillings deposit on the jug and cups, which you got returned when you took the jugs and cups back. But in the field beside the swings there was a table, and you could have a picnic, and the children played on the swings, and that was a great treat for us when we were small. Grandparents and parents used to take us a walk in the afternoon, and we'd swing on the swings. And also people from Great Harwood and even Blackburn at the weekends, summertime, took the children and themselves country walks, and they finished up at what we always called the swings. I should think about 1928, a chap by the name of John William Dean created a miniature Blackpool pleasure beach on the riverbank, which access was from the Marjorie. You walk down the Marjorie, and there's a gate there into the field, and he created this amusement park, and it flourished for 2 or 3 years and attracted a tremendous lot of visitors. There were swings, a hand crank roundabout, a helter-skelter, a small cafe where you could get hot water and soft drinks, toffee and cigarettes. There were large swing boats that would carry half a dozen adults at each side, and there were boats on the river, rowing boats and paddle boats. He even had a motorboat that would carry a dozen passengers, which used to ply upstream from the mill weir to the bend in the river, higher up the river. And people used to flock there in summer. It was frowned on by a lot of people in Whalley who didn't like the disturbance, especially being open on a Sunday. Later on, as it got more established, he created a dirt track, motorcycle racing, and you can still see where the track was if you stand up high up on the nab and look down, and you'll probably see a circle, and you might wonder what it is. Well, that's what it is. It's the old motorcycle racing track, and he used to attract quite big names for the riders who were then riding in the popular sport, and most. Preston had a track, and there was one at Nelson, I think, or Burnley, and names like Frank Very and Joe Abbott and 1 or 2 others used to come down each Sunday, and there were a lot of people attracted. But I remember too, the local lads built a wall of death for bicycles, and it was just a deep pit that you cycled around on the inside, like right in the inside of a basin. We used to ride around there at a rate of knots till they either fell off their bike or came over the top. Quite good fun. But I think, I don't know when it was, perhaps just after 1930-31, two boys were drowned on the river in a paddle boat, and I think it got quite a bit of adverse publicity, or maybe becoming more use of the motor car and people travelling further afield saw its demise in the end, or possibly with the local opposition it was getting. But that was Jazzland, and later years after the war, motorcycle racing or scrambling was revived there for 1 or 2 seasons. They used to race up the Nab on a hill climb, and that used to be very well attended, but again there were local opposition to the noise, and it was discontinued. The first shop in Billington was nearly on the bridge there, and that was the newsagent's shop. And in the 1920s, 30s, it was operated by Miss Annie Brooks and her sister and her brother-in-law, Oliver Exton. Oliver would be up at the station by 6 o'clock every morning to pick up the morning's news on his hand cart, take them back to the shop, and himself and his sister-in-law sorted out the newspapers, and then in the evening he'd be back again at 3:30 to meet the train bringing the evening papers, and this time on his bike, which had a big basket on the front, and repeat the process and delivering. And did 1 or 2 lads to deliver the papers, but mostly Mr. Exton did it himself, and he was a very hard-working fella, and he worked hard 6 days a week. And the name over the shop was M. Brooks. Now, M. Brooks was the sisters, Miss Annie and Mrs. Exton's father, and his name was Methuselah. And he was a bit of an inventor. And I was lucky enough to see one of his inventions, which was left to his grandson, George Brooks, who lived with his mother in Ebenezer Terrace. And this invention was I think maybe I don't know whether they got the idea from the Bible or not, but it was to pour oil on troubled waters. And the theory being that a ship in a rough sea pouring oil onto the water would calm the sea and make for a more easier sail. And with this in view, he constructed a model, fully working model, of a ship of that time, supposed to be about 4 or 5 feet long, and just round the hull below the deck there was a pipe a pipe ran all the way around the boat, perforated pipe, and when the sea was rough, oil was pumped from this pipe and sprayed out onto the sea, and it worked properly, fully, and he sailed it on the Calder. It was a steamboat, and it was perfect in every way, except that it carried so much oil there wasn't much room for much cargo or even passengers, but it was a beautiful boat. I was shown a few weeks ago a photograph of the newsagent shop, when it was at the other end of the block from where I knew it to be. And this photograph appeared to have been taken before 1900. And so evidently the newsagent started at one end of the block there and went to the other. And as everybody knows now, it's recently moved as the shop up to Abbey View, which is the old co-op shop. And that was the newsagents. And across the road from the newsagents there's a little stone building which they did use at that time for sorting the paper out, but it had at one time, before my time, around about 1900 or later than that, it had been a chip shop. But when I was a boy, it was Ted Womack's boot, shoe and clog repairs, and later Ted moved over the bridge into Whalley. Moving further along Bridge End to the two smaller cottages in the middle, one of these was occupied by Charlie Almond, who was the local barber. But later Charlie moved across the road into Terrace Row, and he created the barber shop in the cellar. It's about the middle house on the terrace there. And just a simple affair. He had a couple of forms to sit on, and the table with a hole in to carry an enamel basin so that he could somewhere to put his hot water for shaving, and a swing mirror, which was popular with the Victorians. And that was Charlie's hairdressing shop. He also doubled up as a bookies runner. You could put a bet on there for any race in the country. Across the road again is the wooden hut. This wooden hut was put together by a chap called Harvey Stant. And the Stant family had returned from Australia, and their brother and father were builders. And old Harry Stant himself, they built Sydney Avenue in Whalley, and that's hence its name, because whilst in Australia they'd lived in Sydney. Well, he carried on joining there for a few years, and I don't know what happened to him, but he left, and it was followed by Harry Drinkwater, and he stayed on for a year or two, and then he got a permanent job at Brock Hall as the joiner there, and he was followed by Sally Picking. Everybody knew Sally, and incredibly she turned that into a toffee shop and cigarettes, one or two tables for where you could have your cup of tea, and she was excellent at baking pie and peas, and she served pie and peas to the nurses from Calderstones and passing lorry drivers. But the wonder of it as well, that Sally and her husband, although she was always known as Sally Picken, her husband's name was Franklin, and they lived there. The bedroom above could be seen as you stood in the shop, and it was just a platform with a bed on it. But they were there for 2 or 3 years before the war, and then they moved into Whalley, and she opened a very, very successful cafe next door to the Whalley Arms. There were 2 or 3 cottages there that have been pulled down now. They were pulled down some years ago, but Sally's cafe was well known, and she served the troops all through the war, and the local lads christened it the Blue Pigeon, and she was quite a character. She'd we sometimes knew her as the fasting lady, because she'd spent a season at Blackpool supposedly fasting in a barrel on the Golden Mile. It was a popular attraction for 1 or 2 seasons there, to see the fasting lady, weaker every day, see the honeymoon couple fasting to establish their home. And one gentleman, the rector of Stifsky, a defrocked parson who got himself into some trouble with some showgirls, and he was fasting in style on a feather bed with several scantily clad maidens to help him. But the whole show was finally exposed as a bit of a sham. It was said that they caught the fasters and scoffing chips and fish at midnight, but it was a lucrative business for the chaps that were promoting it, because it was 6pence of time to look. After Sally left the hut, Frank Thistlethwaite, an electrician who lived opposite at the end of the terrace, took the building for a storeroom and workshop. And then he saw the opportunity and he opened it up as a hardware shop. And it flourished for some time. His wife looked after it, and it was a useful service to the village. You could get most anything there in the hardware line. And then afterwards, of course, it stood idle for quite a time, and as in was used for a chap who sold second-hand motor cars and a bike or two. And as it is now, it's idle again. The next business, of course, is the Judge Walmsley. Now, the Judge Walmsley was the hub of the village, where everything went on. And it was a social centre and a business centre. You met your friends there. Farmers sold cattle and sheep there. Taproom games were very popular. And before the band club was formed, it was the only drinking place in Billington, and the only meeting place. Not only that, there was an excellent bowling green on the river bank, which flourished every summer. And that went out of use with the beginning of the war. But if you look down on the river bank, you'll see an enclosed area, which you may think is a sheep pen or something like that, but it's the old bowling green. The terrace row next to the Judge Walmsley was known as Co-op Terrace. That was its proper name, and it was housed the first real co-op shop. I think it'll be number 3, but it was the end one nearest to Longworth Road. If you look at that house, you'll see it's had a bigger window, and that was the first. Well, it wasn't actually the first co-op shop, but it was the first building purpose built, because the co-op movement, as co-ops in the middle 19th century, started in a small way, and Billington and Whalley Co-op started its life in Painter Wood. One or two people got together and purchased groceries wholesale and distributed them in the evening after they'd finished work from a house in Painter Wood, and the business flourished so well that before long they had to employ a man to do it full time, and then funds must have been good because they built Co-op Terrace, and the end house was the shop, the grocer's shop. Again, on the end of that building, they built the first purpose-built co-op shop, which is now being used as a newsagent. And that was quickly followed by branches at Lango and Barrow. They then acquired a shop in the main street in Whalley, and by 1912 they had built their emporium, which is a building big enough to have served the centre of Blackburn, and it's now occupied by the Mooring Cookson and the Spar shop. And it was said when they opened it in 1912 that the late Roger Green, who was one of the Green brothers who owned the mill in Billington, he's reputed to have said that's the end of Whalley Co-op. And it did in the end prove its undoing, because the cost of maintaining that building finally broke the business's back. But Co-op Terrace was the beginning of it, and the co-op shop was when I was a boy, and up to its demise in 1949-50, the shop employed two men full-time and an errand boy, and it was open from 8:30 to 7 at night, half day on a Wednesday, late night on a Friday till 9, and closed on a Saturday at 4. And that was a very useful shop. And then we come to Longworth Lane. The lane from the now known as Longworth Road was always known as Factory Lane, but the proper name those days was Longworth Lane, and the other side of the arches, the old street, was Longworth Road. Now, in the lane itself, there were only two houses prior to 1930, and those are the two stone-built semis. And there's a chap there by the name of Greenwood, Bob Greenwood, and his wife, and I think it was his wife's sister. She was Nurse Exton. And Nurse Exton, I think in her retirement, her later years, turned one of those houses into a maternity and a nursing home. I don't suppose it had more than 3 or 4 rooms, but it operated for a few years during the 30s, and quite a few babies were born there, local babies. And between those two houses and the band club, the back of the band club, was a piece of land that was part of the, I suppose, the house gardens, and members of the Baptist Chapel, Mr. Greenwood included, who was a sort of elder of the church, they turned this land into a tennis court, and it was well patronised by members of their own church and other people as well. Of course, that's now gone and disappeared. Going down under the arches and into Longworth Road itself, there was a little corner shop run by Nobby Taylor. Nobody ever knew his first name, I don't think, but he was a little ginger-haired fellow, and it was a mixed grocery business, and sweets and cigarettes, bread which was bought in daily, and he provided a service to the workers at the factory, providing them with sandwiches and pies and anything else they might need, and the street and Sunnyside Avenue was his bread and butter and main support. Coming back onto the main road again, of course, is the band club. Well, the band club row was a purpose-built shop and cottage and 2 cottages. Now, I first remember that shop as a chip shop. I was only quite young, but I could just remember it as a chip shop. And then it was acquired by a few chaps getting together to form the band club. They were all members of the Billington and Whalley Brass Band. And they acquired it as a band room, and sponsored by the brewery, I think Dutton's mainly. They turned it into, they got a drinks license and a working men's club. And there was the working men's club downstairs and the band practice room upstairs. Well, it wasn't long before the drinking practice outstripped the band practice, and in the end it was the end of the band, because it faded away. But as the cottages became empty, they acquired each cottage in its turn, and the band club now occupies the whole row, and we became known as the band club. And then the people who lived in Co-op Terrace applied to have the name of Co-op Terrace changed to Abbey View, which was the name of the former terrace that had housed, that was now the band club. And across the road in Pleasant View, we always knew that as the wood yard. Now, I can't remember why it was a wood yard, but I seem to remember timber being stacked there, but the business was that of John Ainsworth, the grandfather of the present John, and he originally lived in Longworth Road, but he moved up there, and he was in business as a coal merchant with the horse lorries, and then he acquired motor vehicles, and they had 2 or 3 light lorries, 2 of them employed by Lancashire County, who then sublet all their transport work to small chaps like him. And they seemed to let the coal round go and concentrated on the haulage, subsequently building the garage to house the wagons, and now it's operated by the grandson, the present John. Moving along now to Ebenezer Terrace, number 4, the house next to the chapel. This was a little grocer's shop, and it was run by Mrs. Brooks, who was George, his mother, the young fellow I mentioned earlier. And Mrs. Brooks was a First World War widow, and she was there till about, I suppose, 1935 or 6, when she built the bungalow, the last bungalow in Billington, opposite the War Memorial, and George and herself moved in there. And I think they must have retained ownership of the old shop, because some years later, when George got married, he moved in there, and he lived there as a private house. But after Mrs. Brooks left, the shop was taken by a chap called Edmund Robinson, who turned it more into a fruit and vegetable shop. In a short while, Edmund left and moved to Brownhill, and Alan Aspin moved in there, fruit and veg, and Alan also had a big fruit and veg round where he hawked fruit and vegetables, not only in Billington but as far away as Edgeworth, near Bolton, in a big round there. And Alan continued there, I think, till the outbreak of war, and then he moved down to Chew Mill Cottages. But opposite Ebenezer Terrace, I think probably about 1928 or 9, Manchester Corporation put up a long wooden shed, and they were the offices for the Thirlmere aqueduct that they were bringing through from the Lake District, a big pipeline that they were bringing through to bring water to Manchester. And the offices were for the surveyors and architects who were working and planning the job in this area. And I think by the time, 1933 perhaps, they'd finished their work, and the pipeline was brought through just before the war, and a second one was due to come through, but that had to be put off till the war was over, and since then there are two more. So there are three great big 5-foot pipes that run all the way from the Lake District to Manchester. After the work was finished there, the offices were closed down for some time, and I think it would be about 1936, maybe 7, when the late Bert Wilkinson took them and used them as a workshop. Bert was a wheelwright, joiner, and he's very hard working. His mode of transport was an old motorbike and sidecar, and you see him flashing about the village on this old motorbike with his tools and wood and on the sidecar. And he catered for the farms in the area, making carts and wheelbarrows, fencing, gates. He even made the gates to heaven, because he was a very accomplished undertaker, and he worked late into the night to complete the coffins, and he did everything. I remember he built his first cart and he parked it outside on the roadside, and it was £65 for a full farm cart. And he made flat lorries as well, the four-wheel horse lorries. And then as the farmers began to buy motor cars, he started making the trailers to pull behind them. And he's always going forward, and he really established himself. And as the motor industry began to grow, he went into motor bodybuilding, and that is what, as the business is today, it's entirely motor bodybuilding. Bert retired and left it to his son, and then he began to enjoy a revival of his old trade, which was wheelwrighting. The ever-growing sport today of horse and carriage driving gave Bert an opportunity to hunt around the country, even Ireland, finding abandoned horse traps and various sorts of vehicles, and he spent his retirement renovating and repairing these old vehicles. And he was the last man in this part who could build a wooden wheel and hoop it with an iron tire. And whilst he was at the peak of his business, he built the new workshop around the old one, and they left the old hut standing underneath till the building as it is today was stood over it, and then they took the old building from inside, and that's how it is now, and it's flourishing under his son. As you walk past the chapel, if you look over into the little plot of land between the chapel and the Ebenezer terrace, you'll see a little brick building which is built onto the end of Ebenezer terrace, and that building was built by George Brooks. And George was a very keen scouter, and he was the scout leader of the troop of Boy Scouts that the chapel ran at that time, and they were short of a scout room, so George and the scouts built that little brick building, and that was its first original use. The chapel, the Baptist chapel, the people who built that knew what they were doing, because it's real bang centre in the middle of the village, and it's always gone on quietly without a lot of fuss, supported by probably no more than half a dozen families, but it never seemed to want for money. They could always raise the money that they needed. And there's one thing I should mention that I shall never forget, and that is I think they called it the social hour, who every Sunday evening after their service took a few flowers, not many, to anyone, no matter what denomination they were, who were sick. Young people, old people alike. I remember when I was only quite a small boy getting flowers from the chapel on a Sunday evening. I remember my great grandmother, when she was getting old and frail, and she was bedridden in bed just before she died, and she kept saying, chapel will be coming with some flowers, and as chapel been, and sure enough on a Sunday night they used to bring her these flowers, and I think it was worthy of mention, and I believe they're still doing it today. Walking down the steps by the side of the chapel, coming down onto Bank Cottages, and the first house on the left was the home of Mrs. Greenwood. Old Nancy, everybody knew her as Old Nancy, and she, before there were district nurses, was the village midwife. She was present when I was born, and they used to say, well, I see Old Nancy going on, baby must be due any time. And if you saw Nancy moving about the village, there was a baby due somewhere. And the doctors were very, very fond of her. She did her job well, and Dr. Laurie especially made no secret of the fact that on a confinement where himself and Nancy were engaged, he always carried a small bottle of whiskey with him to either wet the baby's head or to fortify himself and Nancy during a long probably a long night vigil. And then moving further along to the corner of the bank cottages was the shop, Whitty's, as it was always known. This shop was run by Enoch Hargraves and his wife, following Enoch's father, who was the original Whitty, so named because of his supposed wit. Enoch was a Victorian, full stop. His morals, his thinking, his dress, everything. And so was his shop. It was dark. He continued to use oil lamps and candles long after gas had arrived in the village. But it was crammed full of everything and very successful. From the door to the counter, sacks of potatoes formed an aisle with the large wooden bin opposite. One compartment of the bin would be full of chopped firewood in twopenny bundles. The other, firelights, hand shovels, fire drawers, a blower, small hand brushes, anything to do with firelighting and keeping the hearth tidy. The counter ran the full width of the shop and was opposite to the doorway. And on top of the counter was the small box desk in which all the business accounts were kept. A small wooden box was full of small scraps of paper on which Enoch filled in customers' debts and credits and filed them. And he used to leaf through them with a half pencil to find the one he wanted, and add more to the bill if the customers collected goods and said, book it till weekend. Many of those slips, I know, were thrown away unpaid during the Depression of the early 30s, and many a family were supported whilst their children were small and numerous. So some thought him mean, and he was, if he thought the debtor could pay, because he was a Christian also. Hanging from the ceilings above the desk was a bill file where all the accounts paid to the wholesalers were filed, gathering dust day by day. As he stood in front of the counter at the small space kept clear for the receipt of cash, as you looked at the scrubbed white deal surface, in the centre was what looked like a polished silver disc about the size of a 10-penny piece. And it was in fact a counterfeit florin of 2 bob piece, which had been paid to Enoch's father by a dishonest customer. It was said the old man knew who the culprit was, but never divulged who. Instead, he nailed a dud coin to the counter, and each time the miscreant visited the shop, silently with his eyes, the old Enoch senior drew the fellow's attention to the proof of his guilt. A beautifully polished brass beam scale with weights from 7 pounds down to 1 ounce. Another brass beam scale was only used for the weighing of sweets and tobacco. 2 shelves standing on the counter held rolls of bacon, which Enoch cut by hand with a large carving knife. It was many years before he purchased a baking machine, which he regarded as newfangled and dangerous. Boiled ham and tongue also was displayed on the baking stand and was cut by a thinner knife and always weighed on the toppy scales. Between the baking stand and the large scales on the counter, a mound of butter, just as it had been tipped from its mould of a wooden tub weighing 56 pounds. Besides it, a block of lard from its wooden box, which held 28 pounds. Nothing in those days was pre-packed. Almost everything was sold from the wholesalers in bulk, sacks of sugar and flour and oatmeal, tea in 28-pound boxes, biscuits in tin, foot cube sized tins, which fit into a special frame, and removing the lid from the tin, the biscuits inside were displayed. And cream crackers and ginger biscuits and all the cream biscuits in a row together in front of the counter. Everything had to be weighed up. Sugar was in a blue bag in 1, 2 and 4 pound bags. Flour into 7 pound, 14 pound brown bags. Multiple bakeries had not yet arrived, and most people did their own bread and cakes. The weighed up goods were stacked on shelves behind the counter on the end wall. Part of this shelving was reserved for the patent medicines: Hasbro's, Carter's little liver pills, DeWitt's backache pills, Sloane's liniment, cod liver oil and Anger's emulsion, lemon, glycerin and ipecac, bought in so many pennyworths and weighed into an empty bottle you took with you. The remainder of the space was given over to cigarettes, tobacco, matches, candles, wax tapers, cigarettes with long-forgotten names like Robin, Star, Kensington, Senior Service and Duress and others. Cheaper brands were tuppence in the old coinage, for tuppence for 5 in the old coinage. And 6pence or 4pence for 10, better brands were 3pence and 6pence, and the 11.5 pence for 20. In a drawer beneath the counter, I coiled several feet in length of pipe tobacco, known as twist, because it was twisted like a rope and coiled as ship's ropes were in the days of sail. Rice and dried peas and India corn at one side, boxes of apples, oranges, Spanish onions and sacks of potatoes at the other formed a second aisle on the shop floor, which led to the side window. And this window always displayed toys, whips and tops, skipping ropes, penny whistles and pea shooters, boxes of paints, penny exercise books, rag books, pens and pencils, even an occasion catapult. Bone. And always in boxes, sticky catch penny sweets such as kale and the licorice tube to suck it through. Well, the tape is almost running out, so I'll continue on the reverse side. Witties, and I hope you don't think I'm going on too long, but it was a wonderful shop, and it's just to illustrate that even so long ago the traders, and it was typical of many of its kind in villages, were well up to their job. And along the second aisle, hanging from the ceiling, was a large scoop scale with weights up to 1/2 weight, and such weights as 14 of flour and 28 of potatoes etc. were always weighed on this scale. And Mrs. Hargraves kept a special blanket, and she carefully wiped out this scoop and put the blanket in, and she weighed all the new babies that were brought to the shop and kept a record of their weights. Above all the goods on the shop floor, suspended from the ceiling, were racks full of clothing for children and adults of both sexes. Towels, union shirts, short pants for lads, pinafores for girls and women, woolen shawls worn to the mill, and anything really, stockings that the ordinary working class people would need. And behind this second department was a stand, or a bank of shelves, on which was the hardware section. Oil lamps for the table, storm lamps, candles, gas mantles for the newly arrived amenity, for those who could afford gas lighting, a saw, and a hammer, and nails, and squares of old shoe leather for the do-it-yourself shoe repairer, clog irons, polish and dubbing for greasing clogs, plates and mugs, small beakers, the traditional pint pot, milk jugs and chamber pots, teapots, kettles, even the cheap alarm clock. Dr. Lovelace's and Mother Shipton's soap, Lifebuoy and Acdo and Dolly Blue to whiten the wash, a wash tub and a hand basin, and earthenware mixing bowls for the baking. Everything. In the yard at the back was a 100-gallon tank of paraffin. In those days, most houses used a couple of gallons of paraffin a week. Enoch and his father before him knew as much about marketing and catering for the needs of their clients as any modern supermarket of today. The shop's greatest service, perhaps, was the news and the gossip that it passed along from customers to customer. In the early 20s, Fred Ormrod erected the garage near the railway bridge, and he was in business there to repair motor cars. A couple of petrol pumps on the roadside and an oil cabinet, and he carried on quite a few years until he got older, and then he relinquished the repair side of the business, and he turned the workshop into a hardware shop. He sold the first radios in the village. Radios in those days had to run off 3 batteries, 2 dry batteries and a wet battery, an accumulator, and the accumulator had to be recharged weekly, and Fred provided that service. He also had a unique little hire service. For a few coppers, the housewife could hire a shredding machine to shred oranges when she made her own marmalade. And then he extended that to the carpet sweeper. First of all the U-bank, and then hand-operated vacuum cleaner. And then, of course, the ultimate Hoover. And as Fred said, he only hired them out once, because after the lady had used one, she bought one of her own, and he sold them the cleaner. Because, as anybody knows or can remember, to clean a carpet in the old days, you hung it on a line in the yard or the garden and knocked hell out of it with a carpet beater. And it was like a dust storm in the Sahara. So that was a very useful service. He also sold paint and wallpaper and brushes of all sorts for painting or sweeping or dusters or anything at all. And after Fred died, the business was gone, and I think it's been sorely missed. Opposite the garage, the railway bank slopes steeply upwards, and at the far side of the line there's a railway siding, which was always had railway wagons, coal wagons parked in it. It was there. The wagons brought coal for the factories, both factories, and it was carted down to the mills by a horse and cart, 2 horsemen serving each, 1 horseman serving each factory, and there was a stable built on the end of bank cottages where the horse was kept. But as motor vehicles became more into the picture, the factories got their coal direct by a motor wagon, and of course the siding was no longer needed, but it's still there. The access to it is at the end of Railway View. There's a gate on the railway bank, and there was a proper road up there to the siding. Number 1 Railway View, Charlie Whittaker lived there. His family himself moved across the road to Calder Place, and about 1937 he turned it into the house, Railway View, into a bakery run by his 2 daughters, and they employed another girl, and it was quite a busy little shop, all during the war, baking pies and confectionery, which were in great demand because of the rationing and people not being able to get enough fats and stuff to bake their own. So they had to rely on the rations from the shops. And the shop probably continued till about 1950 when it closed down and it was reverted back to a dwelling. The middle shop in the row, of course, is the post office. Well, I think a little before I speak of, about 1922 I think it was, I've been told a chap by the name of Teddy Whitehead, seeing Calder Avenue finished and people living there, saw the opportunity to turn his front room into a little grocery shop. And early in the 20s he emigrated to Canada, and the shop was taken over by a chap named Whitehead, who had been at the co-op, and then he left, and a succession of owners, and it didn't become a post office till about 1930, but it's still there, and I hope it remains for many years because it's a very useful little shop if it's only for the postal service. A little further along Railway View, Mr. and Mrs. Joe Bentham, I think it was the 3rd house from the end, opened up their front room there as a chip shop, fish and chips, and that was a good little shop. especially for us lads when we used to go to Whalley pictures. We get a bag of chips in Whalley, and by the time we got to Railway, we were ready for another. And after Joe and his wife left, and Mrs. Whip followed them. In Calder Avenue itself, about number 10, for a short while, in the mid-20s, there was a man there by the name of Arnold Gornall, and he operated a taxi service. Across the road from number 10, where the 2 district nurses lived in the later years, Nurse Matthews and Nurse Lytle, and they were seen about on their bikes. And later they acquired a little car, and they were supported by membership at about £0.50 a year, and various whist drives and dances in aid of the Queen's District nurses, and they performed a good service. I well remember 1944, I lived in Painter Wood, and a neighbour across the road was serving in the forces, and he came and said, "Jack, my wife's expecting. I wonder if anything happens during the night, you'd mind fetching the nurse?" I said, "Certainly not." Well, the couple lived with her, the wife, the young woman's parent, widowed mother, and she was a bit of a nervy sort of a woman and pretty helpless. And anyway, sure enough, about 2 o'clock in the morning I was knocked up, and the mother in great agitation, the baby's coming, and I had to go and get the nurse. So I walked onto Calder Avenue. It was a beautiful moonlight morning. You could see Kemple Hill and Pendle Hill and Kemple End, and I knocked the nurse up, and she said, "Don't leave me on, I don't walk on by myself." So we walked back together, and we got to the door, and I left her and went in. I'd no sooner shut my own door than she was knocking on the door. "Jack, you'll have to come and give me a lift." And I went across, and there was the new baby rolling about on a peg rug. The mother had got up, and the baby had, well, as quick as that, had arrived on the rug. Anyway, a grand little lad covered in cloth hair and whatnot off the rug, and I had to carry them both to bed. And that was the nursing service. Round the corner in Calder Avenue again, a chap by the name of Charlie Anslow, in the Depression years, set himself up as a pastry cook. And he acquired a tricycle, a bicycle tricycle with a box on the front, and nearly as big as a little minivan, with shelves inside, which were pies and cakes. And he used to trundle this thing around the village and into Whalley, and he was a Londoner. We used to call him Coix, because he used to knock on the door and say, "Any Coix today, lady?" And everybody remembered Charlie. And eventually he packed it up, he got a good job, and that was another service gone. Moving on now to May Terrace, in the middle of the road there was a useful little grocer's shop, a miniature Whitty's, operated by Aunt Polly. Everybody called her Aunt Polly, Polly Aston. A big, generous, proportioned woman. She loved kids, and that shop continued under various owners up to perhaps 10 years ago. I've forgotten how long it is since it closed, but that's gone. And then opposite the mill in Bonnygrass Terrace were Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Jones, and Sarah was left a widow early in the war, and she carried on herself. But they were grocers, and she was a good baker. She started to bake pies for the people at the mill, and they built up quite a good business. Edwin acquired a little minivan, and he used to be down at Longwest Mill every day with a load of dinner time stuff like pies and peas and things like that. And after Edwin died, she struggled on herself, and she used to travel out as far as Brockhall delivering groceries and confectionery and bread. Well, the last shop in Billington was in Industrial Terrace, now renamed Fell's View. And at number 1, Miss Mary Hayworth kept a draper's shop. Underwear for both sexes, young and old, and 1 or 2 blankets and sheets for the bed, and tablecloths, and handkerchiefs, and all sorts of things that you'd find in a drapery shop of those days. And perhaps the most useful service of all that she gave was the buttons and bows and ribbons and pins and the small things that the best housewife used to run out of, and they used to trot in there any time to get what they needed. Well, I think Miss Hayworth gave up around about 1960, and the business was acquired by Mrs. Tom Robinson, and she transferred it to the end of May Terrace between the 2 grocery shops. And she was followed by Mrs. Woodhead, and of course everybody knows now that that's been closed for quite some years, and it's been sadly missed. Number 12, Industrial Terrace, was the police station. We had a policeman in those days, and there was a plate over the door which said police station. And the first one, Bobby, I remember, was Bob Clayton, and he used to clip the lads round the earlobe, and the cry was Bob Clayton's coming, and everybody stood to attention. At number 13, the end house, Jack Gornall lived, and he operated his coal business from there, delivering coal all over the village and the district, along with the co-op coal department, Leslie Saddington, coal merchant from Lango, and 1 or 2 other coal merchants who came in from Great Hourwood. Milk was delivered daily, twice a day in summer from May to September, and such names I remember are George Fowler at Hillock's Farm, Dick Carr, Hodgefield, Bill Allgate, Mrs. Nellie Pye from Nabside, and they all did it with pony and trap, or a horse and trap. Milk bottles didn't arrive till, well, 1930 or later than that, and prior to that it was carried to the door in a can, pint cans or quart cans, and poured into a jug, either held by the housewife waiting at the door, or a jug on the step, or all sorts of receptacles. There were basins with lids on, and jam jars, and sometimes even a saucepan. But that was the milk. Now I think there's only about 1 or 2 milkmen that deliver in bottles. Fish, fruit and vegetables were hawked door to door by Alan Aspdin, Aunt Polly's son, and Bert Lang from Lango. And they had converted, there were big Yankee cars with the body cut off behind the driving seat and a flat lorry put on. They were the forerunners of a the modern pickle vehicle, and boxes of vegetables and apples and oranges, and rabbits, and old hens hanging up from the roof of the vehicle, and holly wreaths at Christmas. On the back of the vehicle was a cutting board and a box full of fresh fish, and a bucket underneath for the fish waste, and half a dozen cats clambering around the bucket every time he stopped, and a trail of contented felines were licking their chops every time that the lorry called with the fruit and veg. And likewise the butchers hawked twice a week from door to door, Ralph Allgate and Sons from Whalley, and John Varley, the Co-op, and later on Walter Thornbury, and they gave a useful service. Unlike the cats, the dogs had their day, Tuesdays and Fridays, when they were left gnawing their bones. I think another service that was very important and I should have been much appreciated was the dustbin service, which was in the 20s and 30s done by local farmers. They collected the ashes, and they also had a square wooden tank that fit into their carts, and they collected the pale closes, tipping them into this tank and then transporting it to the sewerage. The ashes they carried, and they used to tip at one time at Grundy Tip, which was behind Railway View, but later years they moved up to Higher Elker Farm, and the stream there was piped, and it was a deep gully where the stream ran through, and through years of tipping they levelled the land up, and now it's nobody had ever realised it had been a tip, because I think there were one or two buildings on it, but it certainly improved the front of the farm there. And that service was provided by Robert and Joss Soul, and they did it for years. And they also, Jossie used to ride round on a bike delivering milk. So I think I've covered most of the services I can remember. The listener my age may remember more. The postmen, they delivered twice a day, never failed. And porters from Lango and Whalley Station they delivered rail carried goods. The bus service was pretty good. In the early years there were several bus companies operating through here. Pendle, Calder, the Ribble Company in Claremont, and in the end the Ribble Company either bought up or ran off the road the other smaller companies. But the service was good. A quarter-hour service to Blackburn Wednesdays and Friday and Saturdays. And on the whole, it was a very good service offered by all of them. Now, the thing is, who consumed it all? And who used all the services? Because the time I speak of, there were no houses in Longworth Road. Walmsley Brow hadn't been built. Billington Gardens wasn't built till 1950. Pasture land's about 63. And so, who would you think confirmed it all? Well, the thing is, everybody shopped locally. There was no such thing as dashing off with a car to the large supermarket. Well, most of these shops have gone. We're down now to just the two grocery shops. That's the post office and the one in Pasturelands Drive. So I asked myself, are we being served? Well, I think not. The two mills, Abbey Mill and Judge Walmsley Mill, provided a lot of employment. I think altogether between them they employed about 350 people. Green Brothers, who owned Abbey Mill and had an interest also in Longworth Mill, were, I think, great benefactors to both Billington and Whalley. There were three brothers, Roger, Jimmy and Leonard, and Jimmy took a great interest in both Billington and Whalley. If they formed a club of any sort, you promptly made Jimmy a vice president, and you were sure of a tenner, or even 20 at times, and they were known to put their hand in their pocket to help all sorts of organisation, including the brass band. Leonard, always known as Colonel Green, to give him his proper title, was the captain of Lancashire about 1928, I think it was, and he was a keen cricketer. And he ran, or himself and Jimmy ran Whalley Cricket Club. They literally ran it. If you could play cricket, you could have a job at either Longworth Mill or Green's Mill. And there was a time, one season, when the whole 11 players in both teams, first and second, lived in Billington. And they imported chaps to work for them, but primarily to play cricket. Leonard used to take a team of young fellas to the Isle of Man every year, and they played a weekend's cricket over there. The mills ran successfully till 1929, when the Great Depression came, and those years were very, very hard indeed, because in Billington there were whole families worked in the mills, father and mother and all the grown-up children, and overnight they were thrown out of work. And the dole wasn't much good, the 15 bob a week, and in the end, the young fellas who lived with their parents were denied the dole altogether. And a lot of them, the only recourse was them to join the fighting services, which quite a few of them did. But I remember after 5 years, one Friday afternoon, and the mill had been stopped 5 years, Abbey Mill. One Friday afternoon, smoke started coming out of the chimney, and I can see women now in Industrial Terrace and Abbey Terrace stood at the doors wiping their eyes to see that the factory was working again, and there would be work for all those people who've been out of work. But people then never trusted cotton anymore, and no more were children put in the mills. They used to come straight from school, straight to the mill, and they were a living assured. But not after the Depression of 29 to 34. There was only one young fella entered Green's mill. He left school after 1934, and they'd only one apprentice. One or two girls went in, but nothing like the number that had done before. And then eventually, when the mills did close, because from lack of labour, actually, they couldn't get sufficient operatives in the end, because all the workforce had grown up and got old, and it was a dying industry, and eventually it's died. Now, in January 1989, we learned that the owners of Abbey Mill, Harrison Brothers, have received planning permission to demolish the old weaving shed and replace it with private dwellings. Whether the company who owned the double-storey part of the factory join in this venture or not, I don't know at present. But in some ways it's a loss. In other ways it's a gain. It would be a terrible eyesore if it was allowed to deteriorate and become derelict, because these old factories are not really adaptable to modern industry because of the construction of the roof, which is supported by iron poles throughout the building, making the floor space limited and awkward for manoeuvring vehicles or forklift trucks. So before long we shall probably see more changes. The more one reflects, the more one remembers. And I've just brought to mind one other little shop in Billington that was the shop of Bella Thompson. And she lived at Collier's Cottages, which are the 3 cottages used to be there, above Collier's farm on the old road. And when I was small, schoolboy, people walked a lot more. Sundays, it was the done thing in summer to take father and mother and the children for walks throughout the parish, across fields, and over the nab and Cronshire. And Bella had this little, well, it was just a table inside the front door with boxes of toffee on and a scale, and she used to sell bottles of pop as well. And people walking up the old road with the children used to call in for a bag of toffee on their way to Cronshire for a picnic. At Cronshire itself, the 2 cottages there, one of them used to supply tea and hot water. You can get a jug of tea and or hot water to brew your own, and there were lots of people who went up to Cronshaw and picnicked. There's no finer vantage point in the Ribble Valley than Cronshaw because you can see up to Pennygent and down to Blackpool. Unfortunately, you hardly see anybody walking today. If the car can't get there, well, they don't bother going. I remember two other characters that used to visit the village weekly. The first one, well, I can't be more than 5 years old, and I remember him, and he was known as Billy Lampoil, and he had a four-wheeled horse lorry with a big tank on, full of paraffin, and he hawked paraffin from door to door, along with chopped firewood in bundles and firelights. And he came every week. And the other chap, he was from Reed, and he was disabled, and he had a wheelchair which he operated by two hand cranks that turned the chain onto the wheels. And he was also assisted by his dog, a very strong cross, Airedale Labrador or something like that, a very strong dog. And he was hooked to the chair, and he used to pull, as John himself, John Exton was his name. John used to pedal and the dog used to pull. And on John's knee was a big leather box that was full of socks and that his wife had hand knitted and pullovers. And he perhaps used to come around once a month, but he sold knitted stockings and gloves and knitting wool and a bit of cotton and thread and things like that. And he used to come to as far as Elker Lane and then back, and the dog was wonderful because he used to pull him from Whalley up Sandy Brow back to Reed, and that was another character. Another great character was Bert Barnes. Bert Barnes hailed from York originally, but at the time that he visited Billington, he was living in Clitheroe, and he was a travelling draper. And Bert had a bike with two big boxes, one on the front and one on the back. And he used to come around once a month, visit all the farms and cottages where he was wanted throughout the valley. He did a different district each week, and he carried a fair load. He did, and he used to bring this pack into the farmhouse where my grandfather was, and talk. He used to start unloading one of these packs, which was full of drapery of everything, and he'd tell you the story behind everything that he had in it, where it was made. These shirts were made in Preston, and such thing made in Blackburn and produced in Clitheroe. He talked about the weather. He could tell you a farmer how that heifer were doing as you'd sell to that chap at Pendleton. He knew price of cattle at auction mart that week, and he would forecast the weather for the next 6 months. He was a real character, and he always wore a bowler hat. He said it was the finest headgear known to man. keeps you dry in winter and cool in summer. Never be without a bowler hat. He usually wore a brown suit, which was changing colour, and black boots. And he used to, well, more often than not, he was wheeling his bike. There was so much weight on it. But he was welcome wherever he went, if it was only for his chatter. Well, I suppose the in thing at the moment is to dine at Foxfields and pay anything from £10 to £15 for a meal. But when I think of its origins, I have to smile. Round about early 30, perhaps even before that, the thing for the workers in nearby towns was to have a country residence, which they used at the weekend to get away from the smoke and grime of the town. And the country residence was usually a hen cabin. Jack Grimshaw at Rishton would supply a 12 by 8 hen cabin for £8. Or you could have a 12 by 12 for a few pound more. And weavers and tacklers in Blackburn or in surrounding towns bought one of these cabins, persuaded a local farmer to let them put it up on his land, and they used to come out, arrive Saturday dinner time with their carrier bags, and they'd sleep in these huts over the weekend and during their holidays. They spent their summer holidays there. They were the forerunner of the modern static caravan side, and there are a lot of them dotted about the parish. There's quite a few in York Lane even today, although you might think they're a modern bungalow, but that was their origin. And like them, the origin of Foxfields was a hen cabin behind the fence when we were going to school. And the chap who had that, on his retirement, he built Penbryn. It was a little 4-bedroom bungalow with a little toffee shop on the end and a couple of tables. You could get a cup of tea there. And the idea was to sort of a tuck shop for the kids on their way to St Leonard's School, but they were always too busy. We never dare cross, and it never did a tremendous lot of business, but it kept going. And then I think it'd be after the war, somebody acquired it with a bit of enterprise, and they just extended it a bit at the back, and then they got a big car park at the side, and they had coaches calling every day. And then they acquired a bit more land, and they put a petrol station up. They no sooner got it up and going that they sold it off to the Esso company, who improved on it and made it very elaborate. And that was a separate business. But after a couple of years, the new bypass came through, and it more or less eliminated that. Well, it did, it finished it. And then, of course, for Foxfields was extended again to I call it the shed. I should never, in my opinion, it should never have been allowed, because it's a total scar on the landscape, but it doesn't match any other buildings in the parish. But there it is. It's the in place, but I smile to myself when I think about the chap He used to drop off the 1:10 bus at Penbryn and up across the road to his little hen cabin for the weekend's retreat. Well, this tape would seem to go on forever, and in the 2 or 3 minutes that are left, I thought I might remind people or tell others of the wonderful event that took place in Billington, I don't know, 1929 or 30, and that was the visit of Sir Alan Cobham's Air Circus, and they came to Castle Field behind Chew Mill. It's the biggest field in Billington and reasonably flat. In those days you still stopped what you were doing to scan the sky if you heard an aeroplane approaching. They were still a new thing, and they brought with them 6 or 8 aircraft of all types. One of them was what they called in those days an airliner, carrying about 10 or 15 passengers, and it was in regular use, flying across the channel from Croydon to Le Touquet or Paris. And this great airliner, for 5 shillings, they took off and flew round the 2 factory kit chimneys as landmarks and back again. And a lot of people took the advantage of that. But the special buses were laid on from roundabout towns. They came in their hundreds to the top of Elker Lane and flocked down to Chew Mill Farm to see the air circus, where the planes performed all sorts of wonderful stunts, like looping the loop, falling leaf through the sky. One fella jumped out on a parachute, and it was a great thrill. And they also had with them, in a covered wagon, and you'd pay an extra 6pence to look, and that was Sir Malcolm Campbell's record-breaking Bluebird. I know we paid another 6pence and had a look at Bluebird. It was a wonderful motor car in those days, and the whole affair was enjoyed by I think everybody, especially schoolboys, when they did a bombing practice with flour bags, and there were quite a crowd